We have been enjoying our time in Hebrews 11. I've been enjoying my time in Hebrews 11. I suppose I shouldn't speak for you. But we've been looking at the various characters of the Bible and the examples that they give us of what faith looks like. And we've appreciated the fact that the writer to the Hebrews is trying to be very practical. He's trying to give us illustrations, trying to draw us pictures of what faith looks like. And we've looked at a number of people. We've looked at Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Moses. And there's this tendency on our behalf to look at these and to learn from these guys and write things down in our notebook and to see principles, and then to walk away and say, yes, but those guys were exceptional people. I'm not like that. And we say things like, oh, I wish I could have that kind of faith. But then we conclude we can't, and then we move on and just live the way that we've always lived. The challenge that we have when we're studying this is to understand that these are normal people. They did some extraordinary things, but they were just normal people. They had their faults. They made their mistakes. They stumbled along the way, but every once in a while they got it right, and when they did, God was able to use them in astounding ways. Today, we look at some common people. We look at the children of Israel, and then we look at a specific woman by the name of Rahab. And I hope that what you see from this is that normal people, like you and me, can actually live faithful lives. Let me read this again, verses 30 and 31 of Hebrews chapter 11. And both these verses are actually talking about the same historical events. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down. It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Now there's a number of things that we need to do as far as background here, because we left off with Moses, and last week they left Israel and they walked across the Red Sea and some great things happened. And then the writer to Hebrews skips the next 40 years. And we wonder, well, why didn't he talk about any time wandering in the wilderness? Because there really wasn't a whole lot of faith going on back then. Those people were rebellious against God. So at the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, it comes time for Moses to die. And we wonder why God didn't let Moses actually enter into the promised land. All this time he was leading the children to this destination, and Moses didn't even get to get there. But it was because Moses made some choices that even weren't very good. One specific incident kind of ended things for him. He claimed authority, he claimed credit for something that God was doing. God said, speak to the rock. Moses said, do we have to hit this rock for you? As if Moses could produce water from the rock. And so God said, because you did not honor me before the people, you're not going to get to go into the promised land. So the story is that Moses knew that he was going to die, and God was going to allow him to go up on a mountain to see the promised land, and then God was going to bury him himself so that nobody could run to Moses' shrine and worship him. But before he did that, he anointed the next leader, a guy by the name of Joshua. And Joshua was one of the guys that went into the promised land originally. There were 12 spies. 2 of them came back and said, we can do this. God is strong. We can do this. It was Joshua and Caleb. The other 10 said, those guys are too big. And they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because of those 10 guys. So Joshua's still alive. And so Joshua's the guy who is in charge here. Now, Joshua's job is to help Israel take the land that God had given to them. And it was kind of a daunting task when you think about it. And some people have a real problem with this part of the Bible, that Israel was told to go into this land that was occupied by the Canaanites and to wipe everybody out. They were to kill the men, the women, the children, everybody. Because God said, if you leave anybody left, then they're going to pollute you. They're going to draw you away from me. It's kind of like somebody having surgery for cancer and the doctor coming out and said, we got most of it. You got most of it. It means that cancer has a pretty good chance of coming back. And so God was saying, you have to wipe out all the evil. And we say, well, that's not fair. Those guys were already living there. It wasn't their land. It's God's land. It's God's land. And God had a right to say, you can live here or you can't. God was judging the Canaanites for the sins that they had committed, for the rebellion that they had. Even in the Hebrews text, we're told that Rahab was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God. And so this is an act of judgment on God's part. God is using the Jews to judge the Canaanites. So even though this is uncomfortable for us, just understand the mindset here. So Joshua has this big job, and he's a little bit freaked out by it, I guess, and an angel appears to him. And the angel basically says this to Joshua: look, Joshua, God's already beaten these people. You guys just go out there and do what God tells you to do, and things are going to be fine. How encouraging that was, that God was fighting with them. And there's an application for you and me right here already. Isn't it good to know that as believers, we do not have to fight by ourselves? Isn't it good to know that the Lord fights with us, and actually the Lord fights for us, and all we have to do is stand at his side, and the Lord will see us through whatever comes. So, comes time to come to Jericho. Now, Jericho was a fortress. Jericho was a city that was surrounded by a massive wall. In fact, when we look at the story of Rahab, we find out that her house was actually in the wall. So this isn't some narrow wall. This is a thick wall. And so Jericho had this walled city, and they were filled with a bunch of very skilled fighting men. But not only that, when they closed the gate of Jericho, those guys could stay in there for a long time because they had their own water source. And so that idea of putting a siege on, a blockade, and just waiting them out didn't work with Jericho. And so this was a very tough first challenge for the Israelites. And a lot was at stake because, if they mess up this one, we know the Israelites well enough to know that they would all go, oh, we can't do this. We might as well go home. Let's kill Joshua. He shouldn't have left us out here. And that's just the way the Israelites were. They were easily defeated. And so this is a big deal. They can't sneak up on Jericho because most people believe that there was probably about 1 million Israelites at this point. You don't sneak up on anybody with 1 million people. They knew that they were coming. They knew they were out there. And so what do we do? So Joshua goes to the Lord, and the Lord gives him the plan. What a plan. And we read this in Joshua 6. I read it for you earlier, Joshua 6, 2 through 5. Here's God's plan. I have given you Jericho, its king, and all its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn, and on the 7th day, you're to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. And when you hear the priest give one long blast on the ram's horn, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse, and the people can charge straight into the town. Now, if you were Joshua, wouldn't there be a party that says, I'm supposed to sell this to the Israelites? Really? We're just supposed to march around the town and shout, and the walls are going to come down? Mm-hmm. Think about all the Israelites had to overcome. The first, they had to overcome fear and ridicule. Fear, first of all, because this is a major battle. These people were skilled fighters. They knew that they were coming. They would be prepared for them. But think about the ridicule. I mean, that first day, the doors were shut of the city. They were locked tight. Nobody was able to go in and out, it said. And so imagine you're the people of Jericho, and Israel gets up, and they start moving towards the city. And everybody's on high alert. Everybody's in their battle stations. They're ready for battle. And then they march around the city, and then they go back and camp. You would have thought, well, that was odd. The next day, the same thing happens. The third day, now they're getting a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. And now they're starting to hurl insults at the Israelites. Can you imagine this from the wall? Saying, You guys, who's afraid of a parade? I mean, let's face it, there's really nothing to be afraid about in a parade, except maybe those creepy clowns and those really, really big balloons. But I'm pretty sure they didn't have either of those there. And so there's this parade, and day after day, they're having insults hurled at them because you guys are so silly. And so they had to overcome that. Sometimes, as children of God, we will face abuse and ridicule. The world in which we live does not respond well to some of the things that the Bible talks about. The Bible tells us that we should be people of grace. It talks about forgiveness. It talks about all kinds of things, meekness, service, holiness. Those are things that the world is going to look at us and is going to criticize us for. They're going to say, you guys are wimps. And yet God says, just keep marching. The second thing they had to overcome was their own sense that the plan was absurd. I mean, come on. If you're walking around like day 4, day 5, if you're one of the Israelites, aren't you saying, are we going to go march around that town again? What is the point of this? This isn't accomplishing anything. Let's just go I want to get that big mouth, that one guy that's, his voice sticks out. I just really want to get him. Let's just do something. This just marching around the town. God tells us that we are supposed to just do what he tells us to do. Isn't it interesting that Jesus tells us that the last are going to be first? He tells us that we are to give before God gives to us. He tells us that we are to come to him like little children. Let's be honest, sometimes those plans don't sound very good. Sometimes we have to struggle with God's ways and we say, Lord, but that doesn't make any sense. You tell us not to do certain things and we say, but everybody else is doing it. And we struggle with God's plan. And I'm sure that they did too. What maybe the Israelites needed to learn, and what we certainly need to learn, is that God gives us restrictions, God gives us guidelines, not to control us. God gives us guidelines so that we might understand freedom, so that we might be free from the bondage that comes from living according to just our desires. The third thing they had to overcome was their impatience. Think about this. 13 times they marched around that city. And it was only on the 13th time that they saw anything. Think about how frustrating it is sometimes to serve the Lord. Let me give you a list. How hard it is to wait on God's timing when the healing does not come. When you work hard, but financial security continues to be elusive. When you pray for somebody you love to come to faith, but they don't seem to have any interest in the things of God. When you search for God's place for you in life, but every door seems to be closed. Maybe when you feel like you have much love to give, but nobody seems interested in receiving it. It's tough sometimes that it feels like God just isn't paying attention, that it's taking too long. But what the Israelites found out was that God's plan was perfect. Because you know the story. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. And you got to think that the people inside Jericho noticed the change right away. That they begin hurling insults at them as they march around the first time, and then they come around for a second lap. Uh-oh. Something has changed. I remember back in my days in summer camp, and I was a camp counselor. And I don't know if that was a good one or not, but I had the older boys this year, and they said, we need to do something to show these younger kids that we're in charge. I said, well, okay, here's the rule. You can do stuff, but it can't be at anybody's expense, and it has to be funny. Well, that takes all the fun out of it. I said, no. I got a great idea. Here's what we're going to do tonight. Tonight, when they're all settled in, we're going to walk in the front door of their cabin, and we're going to walk out the back door. Then what? Then we're going to go to bed. Well, what is that going to do? I'm just going to tell you, the rest of the night, those kids are going to be waiting for round 2. they're going to be awake all night wondering, when are they going to come back? What are they going to do? And we're going to do nothing. And it was terrific. It was a great prank. That's basically what's happening here, isn't it? They're walking around, and all of Jericho's going, what in the world is going on? What are they going to do? Here comes, what are they going to do? They're going to attack us. Let's be ready. And then they all shout. And you got to think that some of the Jericho people maybe smiled just a tad. Oh, this is their strategy. They're going to shout at us. Woo! But then the walls began to crumble. And the story is that the walls fell outward, which was odd, different. And it's not just a story. Archaeology has actually discovered that the walls of Jericho did fall outward. And what it did was it made a natural ramp so that the people could walk right up the ramp into the city and defeat everybody. God's wisdom was perfect. Now, some skeptics say, well, Jericho was actually on an earthquake fault line, and so it was probably an earthquake that caused the walls to fall down. So what? Can't God use an earthquake? And isn't it interesting that that earthquake happened at just the very moment that they shouted? What difference does it make how God made the walls fall? He did. And Israel was able to go in and defeat all the people of Jericho. And they killed everybody. Well, almost everybody. And that's the second story. But before we get to that, I want to ask you a question. Do you have a Jericho in your life? Some great problem, some big thing. Maybe for you it's an addiction that has seemingly overpowered you. Maybe it's a relationship that seems hopelessly shattered. Maybe you have a relentless antagonist or bully. Maybe you've received a diagnosis that seems pretty hopeless. Maybe you have a coworker who's relentlessly hostile to you every time you try to open your mouth about your faith. Maybe you've had a financial setback that threatens to take everything you have. Maybe you've been involved in an injustice that seems impossible to forgive, or a temptation to just take a shortcut and cheat and get ahead. Whatever your Jericho, it is your opportunity right now to demonstrate your faith. It is your opportunity to show God that you trust Him. It is your opportunity to say, Lord, I don't understand why, I don't understand how what you're telling me to do is going to help me, but I'm willing to do it because I trust you. If we will trust Him in spite of how stupid we think the plan may be, if we will hang on, if we'll do what He says, the walls will eventually come down, and we'll see that God was faithful. The second part of this story actually took place in Jericho. It was by faith that Rahab, the prostitute, was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So what we're told is that this is a woman who is a Gentile. She's not a Jew. She is a woman, and her job is that of a prostitute. She sold her body in order to make ends meet. Joshua was he was big on strategy, and so what he did was he sent a couple of spies into Jericho. And I suspect they walked all the way around, the long way around, so they would come into the city from a different direction than from where Israel was camped. And he wanted them to kind of spy out everything to find out what was there. And so they came into the city trying to be unnoticed. But the city was on high alert, kind of like when we go into high alert because we think there's terrorism around. Everybody was vigilant. They were checking bags that were left alone. If somebody leaves their bag there, make sure you tell us. That's what was going on in Jericho. Everybody was alert to anybody who was a stranger. And so these guys come into town, and why they went to the home of Rahab, we don't know. Maybe that was just a common thing that visitors would come in and they would go to homes of people like Rahab. But they went there, and the people of the town recognized that they were strangers. And so the story is, well, let me just read you the story from Joshua chapter 2. It said, Rahab had hidden the two men, and she replied, the men were here earlier, because they came and they said, where are those guys that came to visit you? He says, I don't know where they were from. They left the town at dusk as the gates were about to close. I don't know where they went. If you hurry, you can probably catch up with them. But actually, she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them beneath bundles of flax she had laid out. So the king's men went looking for the spies along the road leading to the shallow crossings of the Jordan River. And as soon as the king's men had left, the gate of Jericho was shut. Before the spies went to sleep that night, Rahab went up on the roof to talk to them. She said, listen to the faith in these words. I know the Lord has given you this land, she told them. We are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt, and we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things, for the Lord, your God, is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. And then she says, now swear to me by the Lord that you will be kind to me and my family since I have helped you. Give me some guarantee that when Jericho is conquered, you will let me live along with my father and mother and my brothers and sisters and all their families. We offer our own lives as a guarantee for your safety, the men agreed. If you don't betray us, we will keep our promise and be kind to you when the Lord gives us this land. So the idea here is that Rahab is pretty sharp. She knows that Israel is led by the Lord, and because of that, she says, our entire town is intimidated. Our entire town is concerned. We are frightened. And I protected you because I respect your God. So she lies. She takes her own life in her hand. She takes her own standing in the community in her hand in order to protect the spies. And then we're told that she lowered them out the window because, remember, her house was in the wall. And she lowered them down the window. And they said, you leave that rope in your window so that when we come back, we'll see the rope in the window and we'll come get you. But your family has to be in the room with you. Whoever's in your house, that's who will be saved. Anybody else will be killed. So imagine the risk that she took here. She believes them. And so when they first arrive, I imagine that first day out of the 7, she gets her whole family together and they march around the town and her whole family's waiting. And then the second day, and then the third day. And you would have thought that maybe some of her neighbors would have said, you know, it's really weird. This Rahab is bringing her whole family into her apartment every day. What's the deal with that? She could have been killed for treason, when you think about it. But she believed. She asked for a return favor, and it was granted because of her faith. Now, the interesting thing about Rahab, though, is that this isn't the end of her story. When the walls of Jericho fell down, apparently part of the wall that had her house in it remained standing. And so they went in and they got the whole family and they took them out. And apparently they lived with the Israelites from that point on. And we run across Rahab in Matthew chapter 1. Interesting. Matthew chapter 1 is a chapter that most of us don't read because it's filled with genealogies. You know, genealogies aren't much fun to read, but listen to what we read here. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed. So Obed is what would she be? Grandson of Ruth, of Rahab, son of, okay, whose mother was Ruth. Ruth, another woman that we run across who's not an Israelite. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of King David. So Rahab became the great-great-grandmother of King David. And if you follow the line, you know where it ends up, don't you? With Jesus. So this woman of faith had no idea what God was going to do through her life. This woman whose life was such a mess, but God used it in a remarkable way. There's a couple applications that I want you to get here. The first is that the life of faith is possible for anyone. Anyone. Rahab was an outcast. She was a Gentile. She was a prostitute. But she had faith. I can only think that Rahab's life up to this point was pretty bad. You would think that she had a life that she was being used by other people and then tossed aside. That was the nature of her job. She was surviving, but I guess life was probably hard for her. One author writes this: "What nightmares could possibly haunt her dreams that would overshadow the nightmare that comes when she is awake?" In trusting the Lord, she found new life. She found a new family. She found a new hope. But before any of that could happen, she had to take a step of faith. She had to risk trusting the Lord. And it's that same risk that God calls us to take, to dare to trust Him. You don't have to be special to have faith. You simply need to be willing to trust Him. You and I can walk by faith like Rahab did. We too can dare to hang on to the Lord and see Him work in ways that will astound and surprise us. You don't have to imagine what it would be like to be a person of faith. You can be a person of faith by making simple decisions, by taking one step followed by another. The second thing we learn is that faith overcomes. Faith overcame the fortress of Jericho. The faith of Rahab turned her life around. The faith of Moses led the people out of slavery. The faith of Abraham began a brand new nation that God was going to bless and use. The faith of David gave him the strength to take on a giant. The faith of Paul enabled him to keep on preaching even though he was persecuted on every side. And still today we see the faith of missionaries who are allowed to keep going in spite of all kinds of trials, and we see whole communities coming to faith in Christ. See, when we exercise faith, what we're doing is we're giving God permission to work in our lives. We open ourselves up to God's Spirit. God's Spirit is powerful enough to conquer the mountains in your life. Please hear that. God is powerful enough to overcome the mountains in your life and in mine. No matter what the mountain is, God is more than equal to the task. Faith is trusting God with our future. It's when we depend on Him rather than what we can do by our own strength. And when we do this, we give God a chance to shine. I have no idea what God may want to do in your life. For that matter, I have no idea what He might want to do in mine. But I pray that when God calls us to act, when He calls us to take a step of faith, I pray that we would be equal to the task, that we would step out trusting that God is faithful. God simply asks us to trust Him. Bottom line is that's what faith is really all about. Let's pray. Father, deliver us from the tendency we have to dismiss teachings like this as being too far above us. Forgive us for the times when we look in the mirror and we conclude that we can't possibly have this kind of faith. Lord, you've reminded us today that we can. That it's really not about anything else other than letting you do what only you can do in our lives. So in those times where we are confused by what you're telling us, those times where we feel overwhelmed by the Jerichos of our life, we pray, Lord, that you would remind us that you don't ask us to win the battles on our own. You have actually told us that the battle is already won, and all we have to do is get in the passenger seat and enjoy the ride. So, Lord, help us to do that. Help us to stop trying to control our lives and instead to give that control to you. For we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.